There are stories that history teaches you. And then there are stories that history buries. Not because they aren't important, not because they aren't documented, but because some truths are so dark, so deeply uncomfortable, so fundamentally disturbing about what a human being is capable of, the institutions around them find it easier to look away than to look directly at what happened. This is one of those stories. Tonight we are going back to the 1890s, to the gleaming, ambitious, impossibly optimistic heart of American progress, to a city that was about to host the greatest spectacle the modern world had ever seen, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a celebration of civilization, of invention, of everything humanity had built and everything it believed itself to be. And inside that celebration, inside that monument to human achievement and progress and light, a man was building a hotel. Not just any hotel. A hotel with over 100 rooms, with a pharmacy on the ground floor, with a jewelry store, with restaurants and shops and a barbershop and everything a visitor to the World's Fair could possibly need. It also had a gas chamber, a dissection table, a crematorium, a secret chute that ran from the upper floors directly to the basement, and a basement that when investigators finally found their way into it in 1895 would make men who had seen everything stop walking and put their hands over their mouths. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett, but the small amount of history that remembers him at all knows him as H. Holmes. And he was, by almost every credible measure, the first serial killer in American history. This is his story, the real one, not the sanitized version, not the version that gets reduced to a single paragraph in a true crime listicle. The full, documented, deeply human and deeply monstrous story of how a brilliant, charming, completely ordinary-looking man built a killing machine in the middle of the most optimistic city in the world and operated it for years without anyone stopping him. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear is not just a true crime story. It is a story about how evil hides, how it presents itself, how it smiles at you across a counter and asks how your day is going and whether you need help finding your room, and how, if you are not paying close attention, you might never see it coming at all. To understand H. Holmes, you have to begin at the beginning. Not at the hotel. Not at the World's Fair. You have to begin in a small town in New Hampshire in 1861, with a boy named Herman Mudgett who was, by all accounts, brilliant. Not gifted in the vague, unspecific way that adults sometimes describe children they find charming. Genuinely, measurably, disturbingly brilliant. He was reading at an advanced level before most children his age had learned to form letters. He absorbed information with an almost mechanical efficiency. He had, from a very early age, an extraordinary ability to observe people, to watch them, study them, identify what they wanted to hear, and say it back to them with complete convincing precision. He was also, from an early age, intensely interested in anatomy. The official story Holmes himself told in various forms throughout his life was that as a child he was bullied by older boys who forced him into a doctor's office and made him look at a human skeleton. The intention, supposedly, was to terrify him. Instead, he was fascinated. That story may be true. It may be constructed. With Holmes, the boundary between truth and invention was always deliberately blurred. But what is documented, what is verifiable, is that by the time he enrolled in medical school at the University of Michigan in 1882, Herman Mudgett had already developed an expertise in human anatomy that his professors found remarkable. He was also developing something else, a method. At the University of Michigan, Mudgett began stealing cadavers from the medical school. Not for research, not for any academic purpose. He was stealing them, disfiguring them, and then using them to file fraudulent insurance claims. He would take out life insurance policies on fictitious individuals, produce a disfigured corpse as evidence of their death, and collect the payout. He was 21 years old. He was doing this with the calm, organized efficiency of a man who had been running this kind of operation for years. And nobody caught him. He graduated, changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes. H. Holmes moved to Chicago. The city was growing at a speed that seemed to defy physics. Buildings going up overnight. Money flowing. People arrived from everywhere, in numbers so large that no one could possibly keep track of them all. Holmes understood immediately what that meant. In a city where nobody knew your name, you could be anyone. And in a city where people disappeared into the crowd every single day, a few more disappearances would barely register. He arrived in Chicago in the mid-1880s and within a remarkably short period of time had established himself as exactly the kind of man people wanted to trust. He was tall, handsome in a conventional, reassuring way, blue eyes, well-dressed without being ostentatious. He spoke with the measured, confident authority of a man who had been educated and knew it but wore that education lightly, without condescension. He was warm, attentive, the kind of man who remembered the names of people he had met only once, who asked follow-up questions, who made you feel, in conversation, as though you were the most interesting person in the room. He got a job at a pharmacy in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago, working for a widow named Elizabeth Holton. Within a short time he had effectively taken over the running of the pharmacy. Mrs. Holton, by various accounts, trusted him completely. Then Mrs. Holton disappeared. Holmes told people she had moved away, retired. I went to live with relatives somewhere. People accepted this explanation without particular suspicion. Holmes was, after all, a man you trusted, a man who explained things clearly and calmly and looked you directly in the eye while he did it. He took ownership of the pharmacy, and then he started building. The building that Holmes constructed across the street from the pharmacy, the building that would eventually be called his castle by the press and his metacastle by history, was begun in 1887 and took several years to complete. From the outside, it was unremarkable. 3 stories, commercial spaces on the ground floor, hotel rooms above, the kind of mixed-use building that was going up all over Chicago in those years of explosive growth. But Holmes designed every inch of it himself, and he cycled through construction crews with deliberate, systematic frequency, hiring a team, having them work for several weeks, then dismissing them and hiring a completely different crew. The official reason was always that their work was unsatisfactory. The real reason was that no single construction crew ever saw enough of the building to understand what they were actually building. What Holmes was building was a structure of almost incomprehensible deliberate horror. The upper floors of the building contained over 100 rooms. Some of them were normal hotel rooms. Others had no windows. Others had doors that opened onto brick walls. Others had peepholes that allowed Holmes to observe occupants without their knowledge. Some rooms had gas lines running into them controlled from a panel in Holmes's own bedroom that could fill a room with gas while the occupant slept. There were chutes, hidden passages, staircases that led nowhere, rooms that could be sealed from the outside so that a person inside could not get out regardless of what they did. And beneath all of it was the basement. The basement contained a dissection table, surgical tools arranged with clinical precision, a large industrial furnace capable of consuming a human body, acid vats, lime pits, a device that Holmes had constructed himself, a rack, essentially, designed to stretch a human body. He had built, with considerable thought and considerable expense, a facility for killing people and destroying all evidence that they had ever existed. And then he opened it as a hotel. If this story is keeping you in your seat, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Like this video and subscribe to Grimveil Epoch. We tell the stories that history tried to lose every single week without fail. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago in May 1893. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary events in American history. Over 27 million people attended over its 6-month run. The White City, the gleaming neoclassical exhibition grounds on the shore of Lake Michigan, was lit by electricity at a time when most of America still used gas lamps. It showcased the telephone, the dishwasher, the zipper, crackerjack. The Ferris wheel made its world debut there. It was a monument to the idea that humanity was progressing, that civilization was advancing, that the future was bright and clean and full of possibility. Holmes positioned his hotel 2 blocks from the main entrance to the fairgrounds. He had timed everything perfectly. 27 million visitors, mostly from out of town, many of them young women traveling alone, something that was itself relatively new, a product of the era's expanding economic opportunities for women. Young women who had come to Chicago for the fair, or for work, or for both. Young women who needed a safe, affordable place to stay. Young women who perhaps didn't have family in Chicago who would immediately notice if they stopped writing letters home. Holmes advertised his hotel extensively. He hired young women specifically as employees, pharmacists' assistants, secretaries, hotel staff. He was charming to all of them, attentive, often romantic. He had a habit of forming intense personal relationships with the women who worked for him or stayed in his hotel. And then they disappeared. one by one, over months and years, with explanations that were always just plausible enough, delivered by a man who was always just convincing enough, that people accepted them and moved on. She got a better job offer somewhere else. She met a man and moved away. She went back to her family. She decided Chicago wasn't for her. The names of Holmes's confirmed victims were confirmed, meaning proven in court or through physical evidence number 9. But investigators who examined the evidence in 1895 and 1896 believed the real number was far higher. Holmes himself, in a confession he wrote for a newspaper while awaiting execution, a confession that changed details and added victims and removed others with the casual creativity of a man who understood that his story had commercial value, claimed to have killed over 100 people. Most serious historians believe the actual number of victims falls somewhere between 20 and 50. Every single one of them had simply vanished. Understanding how Holmes operated requires understanding something fundamental about the nature of manipulation at the highest level. He did not target random people. He was selected. He was looking for specific things in his victims. Isolation was paramount for people who had come to Chicago from somewhere else, whose absence would not be immediately reported or aggressively investigated. Financial vulnerability was useful. He frequently convinced victims to sign over insurance policies or transfer assets to him as part of elaborate romantic or business arrangements. Youth was a preference, and a certain quality of trust and openness, a willingness to believe that a charming, educated, well-dressed man offering you help was exactly what he appeared to be. He was a student of human psychology in the way that a predator is a student of its prey. Not academically, viscerally. He understood, with an almost biological precision, exactly which levers to press to make a person lower their guard. He was also extraordinarily patient. Some of his victims stayed in his orbit for months before he acted. He would build a relationship, establish trust, create financial or emotional dependency. And then, when the moment was right, when the variables aligned, when the risk was minimized, when the person had been sufficiently isolated from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions, he moved. And in his hotel, movement was easy. A knock on the door in the night, a request to come to another room, for some completely ordinary reason. Gas flowed silently through a pipe while someone slept. A chute from the upper floor to the basement that could transport a body without anyone seeing it move. He had engineered the building to make murder as efficient as the rest of his operations. That word efficient is the one that stays with investigators and historians who have studied Holmes in depth. Because what distinguished him from the ordinary violence of his era, from the crimes of passion and desperation that filled the police reports of 1890s Chicago, was not the scale of his violence alone. It was engineering. He had planned all of this, had sat down, at some point, and designed a building specifically for the purpose of killing people and eliminating evidence, had thought through the logistics, the contingencies, the cover stories, had built it brick by brick with money partially obtained from the earlier fraud schemes he had been running since medical school. He had made murder into a system, and for years, the system worked. The investigation that eventually brought Holmes down did not begin with the hotel. It began with a horse. In 1894, Holmes became involved in a scheme with a man named Benjamin Petezel, a longtime associate, a man who had worked for Holmes for years and knew more about his operations than almost anyone alive. The scheme involved faking Petezel's death, collecting on a life insurance policy, and then reuniting Petezel with his family elsewhere under a new identity. Holmes had run this basic scheme before, multiple times. It was, by this point, almost routine for him. Except this time, Holmes did not fake Petezel's death. He killed him. Benjamin Petezel was found dead in Philadelphia in September 1894. The death was initially ruled accidental. He was discovered in his rented room surrounded by chemicals, and the conclusion was that he had died from accidental exposure. Holmes collected the insurance money, just as planned. But then the insurance company hired a detective named Frank Gier to look more closely at the circumstances. And Frank Gier was very good at his job. Gier began pulling on threads. He found inconsistencies. He found that Holmes had been in Philadelphia around the time of Petezel's death. He found that Holmes had subsequently taken custody of 3 of Petezel's children, supposedly to reunite them with their mother, who Holmes claimed was in another city. The children's mother had not seen them. Gier began tracing Holmes's movements across multiple cities: Philadelphia, Indianapolis, Detroit, Toronto, Cincinnati. In each city, He found evidence that Holmes had been there with the children. Hotel registers, landlady testimony, neighbor recollections of a charming man with 3 children who had rented a room for a short period and then moved on. In Toronto, in a rented house on St. Vincent Street, Frank Gier found the bodies of 2 of the Petezel children buried in the cellar. Alice Petezel was 15 years old. Nellie Petezel was 11. The third child, Howard Petezel, who was 8 years old, was found in Indianapolis. Holmes had incinerated his body in a rented cottage. He had killed 3 children, not for insurance money, not for any financial motive that investigators could identify. He had killed them because they were witnesses, because they could place him at certain locations at certain times, because they were, in his calculation, loose ends, because he could. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894, initially on the horse fraud charge that had first drawn law enforcement attention. He was extradited to Philadelphia to face charges related to the Petezel murder, and then investigators went to Chicago and found the hotel. What the investigators found in the basement of Holmes's castle in 1895 took days to fully document. The dissection table, the surgical tools, the furnace still contained bone fragments that forensic analysis confirmed were human, the acid vats, the lime pits, the rack, and throughout the building the sealed rooms, the gas lines, the hidden passages, the chutes, the peepholes. One investigator, a man who had worked homicide cases in Chicago for over a decade, reportedly walked into the basement, looked around for a long moment, and then walked back upstairs without saying anything for several minutes. The physical evidence recovered from the basement included the remains of multiple individuals, jewelry, clothing, and personal effects belonging to people who had been reported missing in the years surrounding the World's Fair. Documents and correspondence that connected Holmes to victims across multiple states. The press called it a murder castle. The name was immediately and permanently attached to the building. Chicago, which had spent years congratulating itself on its progress in civilization and the magnificent achievement of the World's Fair, discovered that for the duration of that celebration, while 27 million people had been marveling at the dishwasher and the Ferris wheel 2 blocks away, a man had been systematically killing people in a building on the edge of the fairgrounds. The public reaction was a combination of horror and something harder to name, a kind of deep, structural unease. Because Holmes had not operated in the shadows. He had operated in plain sight. He had been known, liked, trusted. He had been a friendly pharmacist, a helpful hotel manager, and a charming businessman. He had been exactly what he appeared to be right up until the moment that he wasn't. This is why we tell these stories on Grimveil Epoch. Not for shock, not for spectacle, but because understanding how evil operates, how it presents itself, how it hides inside ordinary life is one of the most important things a person can do. Subscribe to Grimveil Epoch, like this video, and comment below. Did you know about H.H. Holmes before tonight? Because most people don't. And that, more than anything, is why this story needs to be told. The trial of H.H. Holmes began in Philadelphia in October 1895. He was charged specifically with the murder of Benjamin Petezel, the insurance fraud victim whose death had unraveled the entire investigation. The prosecution presented a case that was, by the standards of 1890s forensic science, remarkably thorough. Physical evidence, witness testimony, financial records, correspondence. Holmes defended himself for part of the trial with the same smooth confidence that had served him throughout his life. He was articulate, composed. He looked at the jury with the direct, open gaze of a man who had nothing to hide. But the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of the murder of Benjamin Petezel on November 2, 1895. He was sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, Holmes did something characteristically, almost breathtakingly audacious. He sold his confession to a newspaper. The Hearst newspapers paid him for a first-person account of his crimes, and Holmes delivered a document that was part truth, part invention, part performance, and entirely consistent with the man he had been his entire life. He claimed 27 murders in the confession, then revised it to over 100. He added victims, removed others, changed details, contradicting earlier statements. Investigators who cross-referenced his confession with known facts found it unreliable in almost every specific detail, while being broadly consistent in its general outline. He was, even in his confession, still running a con, still performing, still managing his image, still telling people what they wanted to hear. in the way they wanted to hear it, for reasons that served his own interests. He was executed by hanging at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia on May 7, 1896. He was 34 years old. At his own request, his body was encased in cement before burial. The official explanation he gave was that he feared body snatchers, a concern that was, given his own history with stolen cadavers, darkly ironic. The more commonly accepted interpretation is that he was afraid someone would do to his body what he had done to so many others. Or perhaps, and this is the reading that stays with you, he simply wanted to make absolutely certain that no one could ever definitively confirm he was actually in the grave. In the decades following his execution, the story of H. Holmes faded from public consciousness with a speed that seems, in retrospect, almost deliberate. The 20th century had its own monsters to process. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, a catalogue of documented atrocities that made the crimes of a single man in 1890's Chicago feel, perhaps, less urgent to remember. He was rediscovered periodically. A true crime book here, a documentary there. Erik Larson's 2003 book The Devil in the White City brought him back to wide public attention and introduced his story to a new generation. But even now, even with that renewed attention, he remains less famous than killers who came after him. Less documented, less analyzed, less culturally present, and that gap between the scale of what he did and the degree to which he is remembered is its own kind of testimony. Because Holmes understood something about the 1890s that made his crimes possible, the absence of systems. There was no national database of missing persons in 1893. There was no coordination between police departments in different cities. There was no forensic science of any meaningful sophistication. There was no mechanism by which a disappearance in Chicago could be connected to a disappearance in Indianapolis or a body found in Toronto. He operated in the gaps between institutions that weren't yet talking to each other. In a world of disconnected records and no shared information, a man who moved constantly and changed his story frequently could kill for years without any single investigator ever assembling the full picture. The picture only came together because of Benjamin Petezel, because of an insurance company that hired a good detective, because Frank Gier was stubborn enough to follow the trail through multiple cities for months. If Petezel had simply disappeared like the others, if Holmes had not, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, decided to actually kill him rather than fake his death, the investigation might never have begun. The hotel might have continued operating. The World's Fair visitors who never went home might simply have remained entries in the city's vast catalogue of the missing. And H. Holmes might have died an old man, respectable, charming, well-regarded in whatever community he had settled in by then. Just a friendly man with a hotel and a pharmacy and a past that nobody had thought to look at too carefully. There is a question that serious students of Holmes always eventually arrive at. Not the question of how many people he killed. That number will probably never be definitively established, and Holmes himself made certain of that by destroying evidence with the same care he had applied to everything else. The question is, what was he? Not in a supernatural sense. Not in the comfortable, distancing language of monsters and demons that the press of his era reached for, because it was easier than the alternative. In a clinical sense. In a human sense. What kind of person designs a building for the purpose of killing people? What kind of person sits across from a young woman who trusts him completely, who has signed over her insurance policy and quit her job and moved away from her family on his advice, who has no idea what is about to happen and feels, in that moment, nothing that would stop him? The modern clinical language is antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, the inability to experience empathy in any meaningful sense, the capacity to simulate emotion to produce the performance of warmth, interest, concern without any of the actual feeling behind it. Holmes was, by every behavioral indicator that psychologists and criminologists have applied to his documented actions, a textbook psychopath. But that classification, useful as it is, also carries a risk. The risk of making him exotic, of placing him outside the range of ordinary human experience in a way that makes him easier to dismiss, easier to categorize, easier to feel safe from. Because the genuinely disturbing truth is that Holmes did not look like a textbook anything. He looked like your pharmacist, your hotel manager, your neighbor, the friendly man at the business meeting who remembered your name and asked about your family. The clinical label describes what he was on the inside. What he was on the outside was indistinguishable from the people around him, and that is the detail that the 1890s had no framework for, that took decades of criminal psychology to begin to address, and that remains, in many ways, as relevant today as it was when Frank Gia was following a trail of missing children through the hotels of the American Midwest. Evil does not always announce itself. It does not always come with warning signs that are visible from a distance. Sometimes it comes with blue eyes and a warm smile and a reasonable explanation for everything. Sometimes it builds a hotel. The building that Holmes constructed, the castle, burned down in 1895 under circumstances that were never fully explained. The fire destroyed much of the physical evidence that investigators had not yet catalogued. Some people believed Holmes had arranged the fire from prison. It was never proven. The lot where the castle stood was eventually absorbed into the expanding city around it. A post office was built on the site. For decades, people walked past it every day without any indication of what had happened there. In recent years, historical markers have been placed. Recognition has come, slowly, in the way that recognition always comes slowly to the parts of history that make people uncomfortable. But the ground is still the same ground. The basement, or whatever remains of it beneath the post office foundation, is still there. And the names of the people who went into that building and never came out are still, mostly, unknown, unrecorded, lost in the city's vast archive of the missing, which in 1893 was an archive that nobody was maintaining very carefully, because nobody had yet imagined they needed to. They were real people, with families who waited for letters that never came, with mothers who asked at the post office for months whether anything had arrived, with friends who assumed, eventually, that they had simply moved on and not thought to write. They deserved better than that. They deserved, at minimum, to be remembered. H. Holmes was the first in the modern, documented, forensically examined sense, the first to use systems and planning and architectural design in the service of serial murder, the first whose crimes forced the amazing institutions of American law enforcement to confront the possibility that the monsters they were dealing with did not look like monsters. He was not the last. In the century and more since his execution, the study of serial killers has become its own field. The FBI's behavioral science unit, the science of criminal profiling, the national databases that Holmes's era so catastrophically lacked all of it, in some meaningful sense, grew out of the realization that the 19th century had produced people like Holmes and had had no tools to stop them. He was the first. But here's what stays with you. When you have spent time with this story, when you have followed the trail from a small town in New Hampshire to a medical school in Michigan to a pharmacy in Chicago to a hotel that was also a killing machine, what stays with you is not the horror of the basement. What stays with you is the hotel lobby, the chandelier, the comfortable chairs, the smell of fresh paint and commercial ambition. The young women arrived with their luggage and their excitement about the World's Fair, checking in at the front desk, being greeted by a tall, handsome, blue-eyed man who smiled at them and told them he hoped they would enjoy their stay. That moment, that ordinary, unremarkable, completely normal moment of arrival, before anything else, when everything still seemed fine, that is the moment that should stay with you, because it happened, dozens of times, maybe more, and in every single one of those moments, the person arriving had no idea, none at all. That is the story of H. Holmes. Not the basement, not the furnace, not the confession and the hanging and the body encased in cement. The story is about the lobby. The story is about the smile. The story is the fact that evil, at its most dangerous, is completely indistinguishable from ordinary life right up until the moment that it isn't. If this story found you tonight, and you watched until the very end, thank you for being here. Like this video if it made you think about something differently. Subscribe to Grimveil Epoch because every week we go into the darkness that history tried to leave behind, and we bring it back into the light where it belongs. And the comment below tells us what part of this story disturbed you most. This channel exists because of people who believe that the forgotten stories are the ones most worth telling. The buried don't always stay that way, and neither do the stories about them.